In the far north of New Zealand, in the Bay of Islands, lies a place called Mount Bledisloe. It has absolutely breathtaking views, and I decided to go and paint it outdoors from life, known as painting on plein air. So I jumped in my car and drove there. Luckily it's not too far away from where I live, only about a 20-minute drive. At the end of this dirt road is an epic view that I've been wanting to paint for quite a while now, so on this particular day the weather conditions were really good and I decided to paint it from life. I arrived at the location just a few minutes walk from Mount Bledisloe itself, and then I set up all my plein air painting gear so I could paint the view in front of me. Okay, so I've got all my gear set up. I'm in a place not far from Waitangi, near Mount Bledisloe. It's just behind me there, 5-minute walk. Got all my gear set up, so I'm going to get painting. Let's get into it. I'm painting on an 8" by 10" linen panel, and this is a medium weave oil primed Belgian linen that's mounted to a board. These are absolutely perfect for painting outdoors on plein air. I'm sketching out my composition using burnt sienna mixed with liquid original. As I'm using oil paints, the liquid original is going to improve the flow of the paint and speed up the drying time. Perfect for when you're painting outdoors, because quite often the paint will have formed a bit of a tack, which means you can layer on some thicker paint a bit later on. Now I picked a nice day to go out plein air painting, but I'm mindful of the fact that the weather conditions can change at the drop of a hat, especially in New Zealand. So for this reason, I paint my dark values and shadows first of all in my painting, then it doesn't matter if the light changes. My distant shadows are going to be much lighter in value than the shadows that are in the foreground, and for those distant shadows I use a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and a little quinacridone magenta. For these much darker tones that are in the foreground in these conifer trees, I'm using a combination of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, also a little titanium white for those midground trees. Now if this is the first time you've ever watched any of my videos and you're new to this channel, welcome aboard. My name's Sam, I'm a landscape artist and I love outdoor painting adventures. Now as I block in these dark values in the scene here, I'll just go over the colours I'm using, which includes titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red light, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue and cobalt teal. Now as you can see so far I've blocked in the major shadows in the scene, and we'll find our darkest darks in the foreground of a landscape. Value refers to how light or dark a subject is, and we'll find our darkest values in the foreground. Yet in the distance the darks are not as dark. And you can see that in the shadows in their distant headland here in my painting. So now that I've marked out the major dark areas in the painting, I immediately then work from the furthest zone away, which is the sky and clouds, so I can start painting in the areas that are in light. The sky is a mix of ultramarine blue with some cobalt teal and titanium white, and then for the cloud highlights I've used a mix of titanium white with a little burnt sienna and a little yellow ochre. Now moving forward to the distant headland, and I'm painting some of the grass that's growing on it. Now because it's so far away in the distance, greens and yellows, they tend to drop out the further away you go, so it's really important that I use low chroma colour here. If the colour is too saturated or too high in chroma, it will come forward in the painting and then we won't get that recession of landforms. So I use a mix of yellow ochre with some ultramarine blue, titanium white, a little cobalt teal and some quinacridone magenta. The quinacridone magenta is going to help to desaturate the green because of the red that it contains, and red is the colour opposite to green on the colour wheel. Also the titanium white itself is going to desaturate the colour. Now as I move forward into the painting, into the midground here, I can increase the saturation by adding more yellow ochre and cobalt teal into my mix, and even some cadmium yellow, which is really going to increase the saturation. But again, I've got to make sure that my colours are in check and that it's not overly saturated. I paint the sea here with a mix of ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, titanium white and a little yellow ochre. Now so far in my painting I'm using reasonably big brushes for the size of the painting that it is, mostly number 5 and number 3 flat brushes, and this will help me get some expressive painterly marks, and then later on in the painting I can add details, because I actually took this painting back to the studio and added more details to it. So I'll show you that later on in the video. For now I'm painting the areas in light of the conifer trees that are growing in the midground. These are mostly Monterey pines because it's actually a forestry plantation, which I just thought looks really nice in the landscape, especially as the sun is in front of it, because this is north facing and we're in the southern hemisphere, and so those trees were backlit, so we're getting these dark shadows and these brighter highlights. Although with conifer trees and trees in general, there's some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape, so even the highlights here aren't going to be that light. Now the general colour mix I've used for this includes yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue and a little cobalt teal. There's also a little bit of titanium white, and I've also mixed in some burnt siennas. There's some red undertones in the tree foliage. And then for the pine trees that are in the foreground, they're closer to the viewer, so I've increased the saturation of the colour a little bit more just by adding more cadmium yellow and even a little cadmium red. There's also cobalt teal in that mix. Now once I'd covered my canvas with paint, I then went back across the whole painting to tidy up areas and restate some of those dark values. And the liquid original that I've been using in the oil paint to thin it with had already started to dry a little bit, allowing me to add some more layers over the top of the existing layer. It was also a nice warm afternoon as well, so that also helped to start the drying process more quickly. As I layer on this thicker paint here, I've also made the value of the colour mixture a little bit darker. Now as I restate these dark values, I'll just quickly talk about some of the gear that I'm using. So the Pochard box easel I'm using to actually mount the painting on as I paint also has a paint palette and storage compartments as well, and it's made by a guy called Ben Haggart who's based in Montana, and he hand makes all these Pochard boxes. They're the best in the industry in my opinion. They're so intuitive and easy to use, and actually if you want to get one, I've put a link to his website in the description box below. The brand of paints I'm using are Blue Ridge oils, and these are an artist quality oil paint. I'd always recommend using an artist quality oil even if you've never painted with oils in your life. Your whole painting experience will be much more enjoyable. If you want to get some Blue Ridge oil paints, I've put a link to their website in the description box below. So now here I'm adding more of the shadows in the conifer trees, and I'm using a mix of yellow ochre with ultramarine blue as I did to start with, but then I'm also adding some cobalt teal, just add some more green into the mix. Cobalt teal is a beautiful colour, it's like a bright turquoise, and you can create some really nice rich greens with it by mixing it with yellow ochre or cadmium yellow. It also combines really well with quinacridone magenta, where you can create some rich violets or blues with them. For the shadows in the pine trees that are more towards the foreground, I've used a mix of ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, cobalt teal and some cadmium yellow. There's even a little bit of quinacridone magenta in there for some of those deeper, darker tones. So if you remember before, I said we'll find our darkest darks in the foreground, so some of these shadows in these trees and bushes are pretty dark. Now why paint outdoors? Well, I absolutely love painting outdoors just because it's good for your mind and body. But also, painting from life and direct observation is a great way to get a better understanding of colours and values in the landscape. Also, it helps to give you a better understanding of composition as well. I've also found that by painting outdoors, it's actually speeded up my painting process in general, and many of my plein air painting techniques I'm able to apply to my studio painting as well. So overall it's been speeding up the process. Now, as well as doing this little painting here, I also took lots of reference photos as well whilst I was out there. This is all information gathering so that I can use this reference material, my photos and my plein air painting as a study for perhaps a larger studio painting. Painting outdoors helps you to capture the actual colours and values of the landscape as you're right there in front of it. And it's a great way to spend an afternoon being outside in the sun, in the fresh air, and painting a beautiful landscape. I absolutely love painting outdoors. Alright, so I think that's enough painting for today. I've got off to a good start with my painting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take it back to the studio, let it dry, and then I'm going to add some details to it, so stick around for that. Okay, so I'm back in my studio. I let my painting dry and then I began to start adding some more layers, modelling the paint and adding some details to it. Now, I could have just left it as a plein air painting and not done any more to it, but I felt it could do with having some more details adding to it because I thought it was a nice painting as it was so far. The other thing is I spotted some errors in this painting in the composition that I felt really needed sorting out, namely the hill that's in the midground where the trees are growing on it. It's kind of formed a diamond shape just below my paintbrush here, and that was really irritating me. I also decided to extend the distant headland as well a little bit, as in real life it's a bit more elongated than how I painted it in this artwork. Now, I'm using smaller brushes than what I was using out in the field here, and this is a number 3 ivory synthetic flat brush, so this produces a much finer mark than say a bristle flat brush, and this is perfect for painting these distant headlands. The brushes I'm using are made by Rosemary & Co, and I've been using them for years. I totally recommend them, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. Now I'm just tidying up some of these grassy areas in the distance, and if you remember what I said before, that the yellows and green wavelengths really just don't travel well over long distance. They really start to drop out quite quickly and get more of a blue cast to them. So our eyes can actually play tricks on us when we're painting distant greens in the landscape, which is one of the reasons they can be quite difficult, because it might actually look green in the distance, but when you isolate the colour, you'll actually find it's often a blue or a violet. Now, the next thing to do here was to get rid of that diamond shape on the hill and add some more details to the trees so that I could eliminate that shape that it was forming. So what I did was I added some more trees in the midground area here. I also made the value of the trees a little bit darker as well, but I'm still using the same colours that I was using out in the field as well. And if you remember, this is ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, titanium white and a little quinacridone magenta. Now, these three colours plus white combine really well. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna combine well because burnt sienna is a dark orange and orange is opposite to blue on the colour wheel, and then the quinacridone magenta gives it a nice violet tint. You have to be careful not to use too much quinacridone magenta because it's a really punchy colour and it can easily overpower your mixture, and so that it looks too violet and it can look a bit garish, so you've got to be careful. Now, moving on to the foreground here, I'm increasing the saturation of some of my greens. Still pretty much using the same colours that I was using out on the field, and if you remember, this was yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, a little titanium white, and some cobalt teal and burnt sienna. I'm using a number 3 synthetic filbert brush as well, so for some more kind of accurate marks here. The bristle brushes are great, but it's more difficult to get finer marks with the bristle brushes, and I just wanted some more chiseled edges, especially in the shadows of these conifer trees, which is what I'm painting now. When the trees are backlit like this and you've got that transition zone between the dark shadows and the areas in light, it really can make some quite dramatic effects in your painting. Also goes a long way to making your painting look realistic and three-dimensional, and then just in general adds atmosphere to the paintings. So this is a good time of day to paint, sort of in the afternoon or early evening. The sun is lower in the sky, and certainly painting a view where there's lots of shadows in it, especially if you're new to painting, is going to make your landscape easier to paint and also look more engaging and effective in the painting. Now I'm moving forward in the painting and I'm adding some of the areas that are in light to these pine trees here. I'm now using a 1/4 inch ivory dagger brush. So this also has a synthetic bristle. You can get some really nice marks with it. You can use the broad end of the brush, but also the tip of the brush is really good for communicating some of those branches and clumps of pine needles. Now, if you're enjoying watching this video, then please give this video a thumbs up, a like, and subscribe to my channel. Also click the bell notification to be notified of new videos. Now then, back with the painting, and what I'm doing now is I'm painting some of these dark shadows that are within these pine trees that are nearer to the foreground. And of course, because they're nearer to the foreground, those shadows are going to be getting much darker, because we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest light in the foreground of a landscape. So again, this is all to do with values, how light or dark your subject is, and this is also represented on the value scale, where you've got white at one end and black at the other, and in the middle you've got a load of midtones. So this is something I'm always keeping in mind when I'm painting landscapes, about the values in the scene overall, because that's how we can achieve the atmospheric depth where those distant landforms look like they're in the distance. Now, if you want to learn more about painting landscapes, then you've got to check out my Patreon channel. It's just $5 a month, and each month I upload a full painting tutorial plus loads of bonus content during the month. There's also reference photos and lesson notes and other things as well. And in general, if you just want to improve your landscape painting, or whether you're a complete beginner or a more experienced painter, or you just want to be inspired by my painting style, then check out my Patreon channel. I've put a link in the description box below. Now I'm getting into much more detail here and adding more highlights to these pine trees here so that they stand out more in the foreground. Getting into some more delicate brushwork, and I've been using 1/4 inch ivory dagger brushes. For the shadow areas of these trees, I've been using a mix of yellow ochre and ultramarine blue, but then also some cobalt teal and cadmium yellow in there, and a little quinacridone magenta, so that bleeds into the areas in light in the tree foliage. Now following this, I started painting the bushes that are in the foreground. There's some much more higher chroma greens here, and I generally mix those using a base of cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue, and then a little bit of cadmium red, and then I add some cobalt teal just to shift that green, add some emerald tones in there, so you can create some beautiful rich greens. Now again, just like with the pine trees, there's a sharp contrast between the areas that are in the full sunlight and the shadow areas of these bushes. So for the shadow areas, again, I'm using a dark colour here, mainly of yellow ochre and ultramarine blue as my base, and a little bit of cadmium yellow and cobalt teal, just to add a bit more of a green cast to the mix, make it a little bit more saturated. And if I really want to go for some really dark accents in there, then I can just mix in a little bit of quinacridone magenta into the mix. I'm still using my synthetic flat brushes as well. Now the way to create realistic bushes and trees is to build up those tones, so we're saving our lightest values until the very end of the painting. So this is going to help to create a more three-dimensional rounded form in these trees and bushes. So what I've done is I've started off with the half tones in these bushes, so these are your general kind of true greens, and then I start to paint the highlights. So I'm getting lighter in value but also keeping in mind the saturation of the colour. So having to recharge that green mix a little bit by perhaps mixing in a little bit more cadmium yellow and cobalt teal. I'm again using synthetic ivory dagger brushes and just using the tip just to paint some smaller suggestion of leaves, and you can see here that they're much lighter in value than the previous layer. So I applied this same painting techniques to the rest of the bushes and trees that are in the foreground. I start adding some texture and details to the grass in the foreground, painting in some of the shadow areas, still using a 1/4 inch ivory dagger brush. And then I paint in some highlight areas on the grass as well. Next I paint the suggestion of some blades of grass, so just a hint of detail. It makes the painting look more detailed than it actually is, and for this I'm applying the paint with a No. 0 ivory rigger brush, so this brush also has a synthetic bristle to it. And then lastly, to really bring out those trees and make them pop, I add the suggestion of some shimmering leaves. So these leaves are glossy and they're reflecting the direct sunlight, so we can get almost a kind of near white. But I've mixed this using titanium white and a little cadmium yellow, and also a small amount of the green mix that I made for those bushes that I was using earlier on. So I just sparingly add a few of these highlights to communicate some shimmering leaves. And then I also add a few highlights to the branches in the pine trees as well, just to communicate perhaps some of that sun almost passing through those pine needles. And I finish up the painting by just adding some last few details. So I hope you enjoyed this little plein air painting adventure, and it's given you some inspiration to go out plein air painting or paint some landscapes. Thanks for watching. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and I shall see you in the next video.